And we're there. Hey there, Robert.
Hello, how are you? I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for being willing to be part of this Role Model of the Month feature. We're excited to hear all about your story.
My pleasure.
So, are you ready to start? The first question is just really about yourself. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your family, your background, your different achievements.
Well, I'm currently working at Heriot Watts University. I'm an assistant professor, like a university lecturer. I started back in April, but due to the coronavirus, I'm yet to work on campus, so we're doing everything remotely. Previously, I worked for 12 years at DCAL in London, at UCL. You know UCL well, Abdi.
Yes.
So I worked there for 12 years. I was a research assistant, lecturer, and as well as research, I organised short courses, summer schools, CPD. I also did my PhD at UCL. My research was on deaf people who know more than one sign language. We know bilingualism exists in spoken languages, but I wanted to know about bilingualism in sign languages. So that was my area of research. And the findings were that deaf people who are bilingual are very similar, although there are some differences, to hearing people who are bilingual in spoken languages. So it was interesting research. So that was at UCL. Before that, I worked at City Lit. I was a coordinator and teacher of level 3 and level 4 courses in BSL. But that was in Britain. But before that, I lived in Australia, and I'm from Australia originally. I was born in Melbourne, and my family is still there. I went to school there, and when I finished school, I went to university. At the same time, there was research on the sign language dictionary. I was interested in that, so I studied linguistics. But before that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do at university. I didn't know what I wanted to study. At that time, there was no other deaf people that I knew that were at university. There were no deaf role models as such. I'm quite old, you see.
Not at all.
There were no deaf role models. So I studied, and then I was asked to work as a research assistant at the university. And I taught sign language, but I also worked at a deaf organisation as well. So I taught sign language at university, and I did that for a number of years. I also did some research, and as I said, I worked for a deaf organisation. It's interesting now how things have changed. There are more young deaf people going to university.
And your family, are you from a deaf family or a hearing family?
Well, my parents are both deaf, and I have a younger sister who is deaf too. Um, my father worked as a carpenter, a shop fitter, and my mum was a typist. It's interesting, my mum had a hearing brother and a hearing sister. They both went to university, whereas my mum didn't. So she was adamant for my sister and I to have a good education. My sister works at IBM, and she's done that for 20 years, and she also works in the Australian Civil Service.
That's great. Thank you. Well, the second question is asking about your deaf story, just relating to your diagnosis of being deaf. And you talked about your family a little bit. How did they react when you were diagnosed?
Good question. My parents reacted very differently. My father was absolutely fine. He wasn't bothered that we were deaf. But my mum, however, she was more concerned about our education, our ability to read and write, so she encouraged us throughout our schooling years. She really encouraged us to read and write. They responded quite differently. I think my mum was disappointed that she had deaf children, when my father was absolutely fine. So it's interesting to see those different reactions.
Wow, that's great. And Auslan, the sign language of Australia, when did you learn that? And also then BSL, you're fluent in that. How did you learn that?
Just before I talk about that, my parents didn't realise I was deaf until I was 1.5. So it was quite late actually. They were shocked when they found out. We all communicated with sign language in the family home. So they were really surprised when I was deaf, when they were told I was deaf. So they had to organise my education. You know, at school I had to wear hearing aids. Well, it was radio aid at that time, a body worn radio aid. So we used Auslan. So it's very similar to British Sign Language. In fact, it's a dialect of British Sign Language. And there are dialects of British Sign Language in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. So when I came to London, the Margate School for the deaf. There was a teacher from there who went to Australia and set up the first deaf school in Melbourne, which meant there was a lot of Margate signs and London signs of the south part of England. So they were used, and the sign for interpreter, there was no sign for interpreter back then, but we have this sign in BSL for interpreter and this sign in Auslan for interpreter. So when I come to London, I had to learn those differences. But I adapted, and fortunately I mixed with a lot of deaf people and I picked it up fairly easily. I remember when I first met you, I was only here for maybe 1 or 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 1 or 2 years I think it was. And I was still learning BSL back then.
Great. What about your education journey? What barriers did you face? What was your experience at school and university?
I went to a deaf school initially. We didn't use sign language. It was an oral school back in the 70s and the 80s. Oralism was very strong back then. And then I went to a mainstream school. That was my secondary school. In the last 2 years, I was given a note taker, which was helpful. It allowed me better access to education. And then when I went to university, they organised interpreters and note takers. And that was well, but I didn't have the same experience as hearing people at university. There was no deaf role models back then, which I mentioned. And so if I had a problem or an issue, I kind of had to navigate things myself. And the interpreters weren't regular interpreters. They changed often enough. That was another problem. I also remember at university, it wasn't just going to classes and going to lectures, but there was also that social side, learning from other students, discussions, debates. As a deaf person, I didn't have access to that. So I was the only deaf person there. Groups and societies and clubs, again, I didn't participate in those. Political debates I didn't participate in. So I just went to class, I did my studies and work, but I missed out on all the other things. I was like a student visiting the university and then I'd come back and get on with my life. So I had a very different experience to other people. And I think, it's the same for other students, missing out on all those other things.
Yeah, I agree. I remember myself when I was at university, all the clubs and societies weren't accessible to me.
Exactly. So the support systems, the networks weren't there for me. I didn't know how to ask, or I couldn't ask other people. And I think that was the case back then, and I think it's also the case now for many deaf students. It can be a lonely experience at university. I did a BA, then a BEd, then an MA in Linguistics, and then I come to London and study my PhD at UCL. But it was because of Bentsi Wall that I did my PhD. When I met her, she said to me, "When are you going to do your PhD?" I never thought I would do a PhD, to be honest. So that was interesting. She was the first person to say, "Come on, Robert, you can do it." And then I started, and that's how I got my PhD.
So if you hadn't met, your path could have been very different.
Yes, my path may have been different. Who else would have had that background, experience, and knowledge of sign language that really supported me as a deaf person?
We're just thinking generally, what would you say are the barriers that you've met in life? And more importantly, how have you overcome them?
Well, that's a big question. Barriers. Well, I think at the moment with coronavirus, there's a problem there. Before I'd go to work and meetings, we wouldn't have to use computer platforms. You'd attend meetings, you'd go to university, you'd teach, you'd lecture, but now everything is moved online. We have to use MS Teams or Zoom. What do you prefer?
I
Zoom
prefer
or MS
Zoom.
Teams?
Yeah.
Zoom.
Teams is just really unstable.
I think there's always problems with quality, with the signal. If interpreters don't have a good connection, again, I don't have access. Work is fine, but with other areas, when I have to attend meetings with other people external from the university, they say we have to use MS Teams because of security, or they say they can't use Zoom because of a contract they have, and there's concerns over security, as I said. And I say, what's more important, deaf access or security? So I want to attend meetings. They say, I'm sorry, we can't use Zoom. And I say, well, I can't access the meeting then. And I raise the Equality Act as an issue. If I try to pin the interpreter on Teams, then they disappear. And there's so many different perspectives when you're looking at it online. I think that's a difficulty. Accessing meetings. I went to attend a government department, and they said it's MS Teams. And I said, well, what about the Equality Act? What's more important? A contract or security or deaf people's access? It's a big struggle at the moment. And I think it's a lot of people struggling throughout Europe, in the UK, and around the world. And the problem is various computer platforms.
Great. Well, your expertise is in linguistics. So, what attracted you to that initially? Maybe you could tell us a bit more about why you chose that field of study.
People say when you're going to leave school, what do you want to do? I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. But because of the Sign Language Dictionary project back then, I decided to study linguistics. I was interested in that project and that research. If it wasn't for that, I probably would have studied something else. I thought about psychology. I thought about studying to become a teacher. But because of this, I was inspired and I decided to study linguistics, and that's the path I took.
So, thinking about linguistics, would you say that linguistics and deaf culture are related?
Well, linguistics and deaf culture, there's been a lot of research in sign languages, regional variation, and so on and so forth. But there's not much research into culture, and there's not enough research into deaf people themselves, deaf identity. We have deaf studies and deaf culture, but within that, they don't really talk about race, they don't talk about black people. We're doing some research at Heriot-Watt into deaf identity, intersectionality, and there's pockets of that. UCL also researching into deaf identity, but there's a lack of discussion around deaf identity in the deaf community, gender, and so on. As I said, there's been a lot of research into the linguistics of sign language, but what about deaf identity? But also, this raises the question about diversity amongst researchers. Now that's interesting.
Yeah, that is a good question. Just before I ask you the next question, we're just missing your hands a little bit. Could you just raise them? Yeah, thanks. So, the next question, do you think that the deaf community should learn more about linguistics? Learn about deaf history, deaf culture? And if so, why?
I think that because deaf people are part of a minority community, knowledge is power. Knowledge of sign language, knowledge of deaf culture and deaf history form a deaf person's identity. And oppression, whether that's from our history through oral education that's opposed to sign languages, that may be one oppression for one deaf person, another because of a deaf person from a different heritage. It could be through deaf education or oralism. It's all encompassing. If a deaf person knows the reason why they're oppressed, if they know their language and their culture and their history, then they can deal with that oppression and realise it belongs to the oppressor.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. So, thinking about your experience of working and also going through education in Australia, the UK, and America, what would you say are the similarities if you had to compare them? What are the differences in your experience?
I think we look at America, Australia, and the UK, there are equality laws in place. There's the Disability Discrimination Act, and there are equivalent laws in those countries. So it means that we have fair access. Now, that access differs, I think, it differs between different countries. In America, for example, there's greater access to telephone interpreting, remote interpreting. That's less in the UK, more so in Australia. And in America, there's deaf universities, Gallaudet University, NTID. In the UK, there's access to universities with interpreters. I think also in the UK, there's more access to colleges. There are more deaf colleges like City Lit or Doncaster or Derby colleges. In Australia, we don't have that. So there are differences.
And how do you think the UK could do better? How could we catch up with America and what they provide? What could we do to improve?
It depends if you have the money to set up a deaf university. That's going to be very expensive. But I think there needs to be a centralized information point where deaf people can contact that point to understand how they can access university, where they can get interpreters or note takers, and what support is available. That information is lacking. And also maybe a foundation skills course for deaf people. There's nothing like that. If people want to go to university but they're not quite ready and they want to brush up on their English and maths and other skills, I think that's lacking. Some kind of centralised support base or centralised support centre for deaf people, so they can then move on to university. You never know.
Great. So maybe you could tell us now a little bit about your work with the World Federation of the Deaf, the WFD.
I'm in the expert committee within WFD. So WFD brings in a number of deaf people from around the world, men and women, and we form part of a committee. So the board of WFD, if they want to consult or if they need to lobby or need specific information which they don't know the answer to, they would ask us, the expert committee, and we can quickly find that information, formulate it, and pass that over. That could be kind of a referral. We're kind of a clearinghouse for information for the WFD board. They can't know everything, they don't know everything, so they do need to ask other people to assist them with that. So we would pass on information, we would write papers, position statements, and so on.
Lovely. So, looking back, what do you wish you knew before you went into university or the world of work?
I wish two things. I wish I understood what university actually meant and not just attending a course. For my own personal development, I wish I had the opportunity to talk to others whilst I was at university. And I also would say, pick what you want to study, what you are interested in, not what other people think you should do. Think of what's important for you, something you're passionate about.
Great. So, you're heavily involved in a deaf community and you identify as deaf. What makes you proud to be deaf?
Oh, without a doubt, I'm proud to be deaf. I think deafness is the most important part of my identity. When I wake up in the morning, I wake up as a deaf person. I see the world as a deaf person. I interact as a deaf person. My experience of oppression, barriers, But at the same time, I have an extremely rich life. I use sign language. I meet friends and I communicate with them in sign language. I met you for the first time 15 years ago and we've kept in touch. I have a very rich life.
Yeah. So, who would you say inspires you? Maybe from within the deaf community or just generally?
Who inspires me? I would say Abigail Gorman. She inspires me. And I would say that because she's a young deaf woman. She has a similar background to me. She's from a deaf family. And I mentioned that she's from a deaf family. She's passionate. She's passionate about what's right in life, what's fair for people. She fights for that. I think Abigail shows that you must stand up for what you believe in. You must try and make life better for everybody. That's why she inspires me.
Yeah, that's great. So, another question. A lot of people talk about being an ally. Is there a sign for ally? What sign do you use?
This sign, ally, I think.
Great. Okay. So, what do you think hearing people could do more to be an ally to the deaf community? What would you say are the do's and don'ts?
Well, you can't define this in black and white areas. I think, for example, Bensi Wall, when she told me, come on, do your PhD, she encouraged me. She was possible. She told me that I could do it, that it was possible for me. There are other people who know sign language and they do sign songs and they promote themselves on Facebook and social media. They're false allies, I think. There are some great allies and there are others less so. I think what is important is that, people support you, they keep in touch, they try to stop oppression for deaf people.
That's great. Well, we always ask people for 3 tips. So, what would be your 3 tips for everyday life that you wish deaf people would know?
I think listen to people. That's important. Listen to stories, listen to what people tell you. Sometimes when you're young, you don't realise, but when you're old and look back about what someone told you, that's important. But secondly, believe in yourself. Believe that you can do it, no matter what, no matter where you are in life. Believe that you can do it. Believe in yourself. And thirdly, be passionate about something. Aim for that. Don't give up. Don't let people oppress you. Don't let society say you can't do something. Do it anyway. And I think that would be my important tip. Keep going. Persevere until you achieve something.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you so much for being part of this interview. I'm sure many young people and older ones too are going to be inspired hearing about your responses and about your journey. So, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for asking me. It's been an
Oh, you're
honour
welcome.
to
Thank
support your
you.
project, Abdi. Good luck
Take
with the
care.
work ahead. Thank you and take care and keep in touch. Bye bye for now. Cheers.